Welcome to The View from 22. I'm Ben Lazarus, the Spectator's Special Projects Editor. After the airstrike on a Gazan hospital last night, it appears that the conflict is going to heat up this week. The Israelis have provided ample evidence that suggests it wasn't them, although Hamas and the Arab world are still insisting that it was an Israeli airstrike. Joining me to discuss this and other aspects of the wider conflict is Benny Morris, one of Israel's most eminent living historians. Morris is part of a group of historians who were termed the new historians in Israel for taking a revisionist look at what preceded 1948 and also the 1948 war itself. Morris refused to serve in the occupied West Bank and was briefly imprisoned. But despite this, he's not universally liked by the left for his criticism of the Palestinian authorities and their rejectionism of a two-state solution. So, Benny, thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
I thought I'd start things by asking about your views on the attack on the Gazan hospital yesterday and the airstrike and the sort of subsequent fallout that we've seen across the Arab world.
Well, to begin with, it seems to me that the IDF produced convincing evidence that it was a rocket which was fired by the Islamic Jihad and fell by accident on the hospital grounds. It wasn't the result of an Israeli air attack. They checked with the Air Force, no plane was flying at the time, and they have a recording of Hamas activists saying that where the rocket came from and there was an Islamic Jihad rocket.
But regardless of that, how much of a flashpoint moment do you think this might prove to be within the Arab world itself?
I think it'll pass. It obviously has enraged the Arab world because the Arab world believes what Hamas says. Hamas always lies, and the lies are always absorbed and accepted by the public, basically ignorant public in the Arab world.
And what do you make of Joe Biden in Israel today and his comments?
What happened at the hospital, he seemed to support and accept the Israeli version of what happened. But I think this is less important. I think the war itself has not yet begun. The Israeli offensive against the northern part of the Gaza Strip will proceed, I assume, in the coming days. And this will be just one event in a chain of events, which began, of course, with the terrorist attack by the Hamas, in which 1,000 civilians were murdered. Many in their beds, many children, many women raped, etc.
And could you see a situation where Israel ends up fighting a war on two fronts, both in the Gaza Strip and also on the Lebanon border with Hezbollah?
Unfortunately, it's a good possibility. At the moment, my assumption is, along with some commentators, that Iran is not interested in the Hezbollah in Lebanon joining the war, fully joining the war, because Israel will strike back. It'll of course be very difficult for Israel to fight on two fronts, but the Hezbollah might lose a lot of its power, much of its weaponry, many of its people in such a war with Israel. And I think Iran wants to save the Hezbollah and its deterrent effect on Israel to preserve, protect its nuclear installations and its nuclear program. That's what they built up the Hezbollah with 150,000 rockets in their storerooms to deter Israel from attacking the Iranian nuclear project. So I think they will want to preserve it, but it could be the pressures from below, from the Arab world, from preachers, will be such that the Hezbollah will gradually join the war full-fledged, and then Israel will face a two-front war, which will be very difficult.
And could you see a ground invasion of Gaza being a success in terms of in military terms?
Well, it depends what the aims are. If the aim is, as they originally said, the generals, etc., that it is to utterly destroy the Hamas, that it sees being a military force and threat, which could again launch such a strike against Israel in the future. If that's the aim, it's going to be a long, hard slog. Israel will do it slowly, I assume, house by house, neighborhood by neighborhood, in Gaza City and around it, and perhaps later on in the southern part of the Strip. Israel will do it slowly because it'll want not to kill civilians, but it'll also want to preserve its own troops from dying in firefights with Hamas gunmen. But I assume it can be done if Israel is allowed the months of battle which this will take.
Benny, you said before that the extremists on both sides of Israel-Palestine, the extreme voices are too loud, too prominent, and as a result, the moderate voices get drowned out. After the potential ground invasion of Gaza and once the war heats up even more, is there not a case that the extreme voices within the Palestinian ranks will only get more and more extreme?
I assume that will happen certainly in the first period of this ground invasion, when Israeli tanks and troops roll into the neighborhoods of Gaza, and a lot of civilians will die in the process, a lot of Hamas gunmen will die in the process. But if the thing is successful, if the offensive is successful, my assumption is this will strike into the minds and psyches of all Palestinians. They will understand that they have been made to pay a terrible price for their attack on the 7th of October against Israel's villages around the Gaza Strip, and perhaps it'll make them even more moderate, but I don't know. You're probably right that these sort of things tend to certainly, at least initially, produce more extremism.
Now, but Benny, earlier this year, you were a signatory on a letter accusing American Jews of not paying enough attention to Israeli apartheid and ethnic cleansing within Palestine. To what extent do you blame the sort of mistreatment of Palestinians on what we saw 2 weeks ago on October the 7th?
There is a vital link between the Hamas offensive and the atrocities it committed and the history of the conflict, which involved Arabs attacking Jews initially, massacring Jews in various places, such as Hebron in 1929, and Israelis massacring Arabs in the 1948 war, and continuous back and forth between Arab guerrilla or terrorist attacks, Palestinian, and Israeli retaliation and counterinsurgency in the schools in the West Bank, and especially under Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Hatred has been taught to kids from the moment they're born, essentially, and they grow up hating Jews and hating the state of Israel for what it has done, and it has done things to the Palestinians, without, of course, them being taught the things the Arabs have done to the Jews. This is a product in some way of that.
Can you ever see that being resolved?
Unfortunately not. I don't see the way forward. The idea of a two-state solution, in my view, is unrealistic. The Palestinians have always rejected every compromise based on two-state proposals under the British in the Peel Commission 1937, the United Nations General Assembly 1947, Clinton, Barack 2000. They've always rejected the idea of a Jewish state alongside an Arab state in a partitioned Palestine. And they continue essentially in their hearts to believe the Zionist enterprise is a robber enterprise and Israel is a robber state, and they refuse to accept its legitimacy. And so long that is their mindset, they will not agree to partitioning Palestine into two states. In addition to that, Israel has moved to the right. The Israel settlement enterprise has blossomed, essentially taking over the land in the West Bank, which would be part of a Palestinian Arab state, were there to be a two-state settlement. What that means essentially is that the settlement enterprise is a major impediment to Arab acceptance of a two-state settlement, were they willing to countenance an Israeli state in the land of Palestine or the land of Israel.
So what do you foresee, that the status quo just continues for decades to come?
Yes.
And, you know, you were always sort of considered of the left, and your writing on the original creation of Israel sort of saw you as a revisionist historian, and you were sort of embraced by the left. But over the years, you've been quite dismissive of sort of Palestinian rejectionism of a two-state solution. Do you still consider yourself part of the left?
I would say yes, because theoretically, in terms of ideas, I think a two-state solution is the only solution which gives both people a measure of what they desire and a measure of justice. Palestine ruled and governed only by the Arabs does not give the Jews justice. A land of Palestine completely dominated and governed by the Jews, all of it in Jewish possession, does not give the Arabs, the Palestinian Arabs, a modicum of justice. So I still believe that, but I don't see any realistic way to get to a two-state solution given the circumstances.
Now, Benny, you've spoken before about how, in many ways, this conflict has now become a sort of broader clash of civilizations.
There is a clash of civilizations, if you like, but it's part of the clash of civilizations between the Muslim world, essentially, in my view, or if you like, the extremist Muslim world, but I fear it's the Muslim world, in fact, and the West. The values of these two worlds are completely different, and they're clashing continuously in the streets of Belgium or wherever, where a Muslim yesterday murdered 2 Swedes because they were Christians or infidels. The clash in Palestine is part of it. The Turkish Muslim destruction of their Christian minorities 100 years ago is part of it. These are all parts of this clash of civilizations.
And where do you see Iran's role within that today?
Iran? Well, Iran is at the vanguard of this Muslim effort to dominate the Middle East and perhaps even for Islam to take over the world down the road. And they think in these terms. It seems strange in Western ears, but they do think that Islam is the right religion, Allah is the right God, and eventually he will win over the whole of the world. This is what they really want. This is what Bin Laden said. This is what they desire. And Iran is at the forefront of this effort.
But you don't see Iran entering the fray in this current round of conflict?
I don't know. As I said, I think there's a problem for them with, if you like, expending or wasting the Hezbollah on this effort to protect the Palestinians in Gaza, when in fact Iran wants them to protect Iran itself and its nuclear installations as a sort of a forward post and a deterrent force against Israel. So I don't know. But it's quite possible Iran will be sucked in. The Americans have sent some of their armed forces to the area, these 2 carriers and some other units to ward off the Iranians. But should Iran be sucked in, I wouldn't be surprised if the Iranians are hit by the Americans. It's also quite possible that if the war degenerates or expands to involve the Hezbollah as well, maybe Israel or the Americans will use the opportunity to destroy the Iranian nuclear installations, which it has long targeted in a sense ideologically. That is, Iran says it wants to destroy Israel. It's building an atomic weapon with which it could do this. Israel has always said we will never allow, and so have the Americans, we will never allow the Iranians to have nuclear weapons because they can't be trusted with them and they intend to destroy neighbors. So it's quite possible this might end up with a Israeli or Israeli-American campaign to destroy the Iranian nuclear capabilities.
Would you like to see that happen?
Yes.
Earlier in the discussion, you mentioned that what we're seeing today has sort of very historical roots. You've done more to uncover bad things that the Zionist campaigners did in the run-up to the 1948 war and including the 1948-49 war. At the same time, if you were to look at Hamas's charter, it's obviously a very explicitly anti-Semitic document. How separate are those two things? What's more the guiding influence for what we're seeing Hamas do today? Is it historical injustices, or is it the fact that they simply really do not like Jews living in Palestine at all?
It's probably a combination. I wouldn't know which is. It depends on each person and what's in his mind. But essentially, both things converge. Things they see that the Jews have done, which they regard as nasty, and some of which were nasty, and their ideology, which basically rejected any Jewish presence, certainly a sovereign presence in Palestine or any part of Palestine. These things converge in their minds. They're, as I say, brought up on this ideology, as I think and I fear Iranian children are today. This is basically sort of a nihilistic approach to international relations, it leads to the acts of terrorism, the sorts of terrorism we saw, and some depraved behavior by the Hamas fighters when they entered the Jewish settlements on October 7th.
And if you were Prime Minister, if you were Benjamin Netanyahu, what would you do in response to those attacks?
Well, I wouldn't like to be Benjamin Netanyahu. He's an awful Prime Minister, a corrupt politician, and should have been gotten rid of long ago. I think that he's being forced by the Israeli public and the security and defense establishment to launch this offensive, which I presume will begin in a few days, because that's essentially what Israel wants. Partly it's revenge. You don't let a terrorist organization kill 1,000 of your civilians and in monstrous ways and let them get away with it. You have to, and this is the Middle East, you have to understand the mentality of the Middle East. If the Hamas gets away with it, Israel is a goner, it's a loser. It will never be respected, and others will do the same to Israel next week or next month or next year. And the Hamas will do it again if it still exists. You must crush the Hamas. I think this is a generally accepted by the Israeli public today. Netanyahu has always been a bit of a coward. He's always been afraid to launch major military operations. He always talks big, but has never done anything. And that's why the Hamas grew into this monster which has recently emerged. He's also allowed the Hezbollah to grow into an even larger organization than the Hamas. But I think he will have no choice now but to launch this offensive to destroy the Hamas, and I believe in it too. I think the Hamas must be destroyed.
Last night after the hospital airstrike, there was protests in the West Bank, and there's been some skirmishes there over the last week or two. You previously served in jail time for refusing to serve in the IDF in the West Bank and the occupied territories. How concerned are you about a potential uprising in the West Bank and more skirmishes taking place there as well as in Gaza?
They're two different things. I don't anticipate an uprising in the West Bank. I think Israel's security forces, the Shin Bet, the border police, the army, have a sufficient grip on the West Bank to prevent a rebellion, a massive rebellion, but there will certainly be clashes, as there were, as you say, last night after they bought the Hamas story about what happened at the hospital yesterday. There will be further clashes. Their Palestinian brothers, that is the West Bank Palestinians, brothers in the Gaza Strip, are getting a terrible pounding from the Israeli Air Force, which I think is trying to kill and destroy Hamas targets, but without doubt is also killing civilians, a lot of them. They feel, these are their brothers, and they will continue, I think, to try to demonstrate against what Israel will be doing in the coming months in the Gaza Strip. And there will be clashes, and I assume Israel will be able to suppress any rebellion there.
And Benny, you've written before about the demographic crisis that Israel potentially faces. You've written about how the right-wing religious sects have many children compared to the sort of liberal, secular Israelis. How do you think that might play out in the coming decades?
As it looks today, it looks like it's going to play out terribly for Israel, for Israeli society, and I think it'll also have an impact on the Palestinians. Israelis have drifted to the right over the past decades. In large measure, this has been a product of demography. It's a matter of the growth, that is the population growth of the religious sector in the Jewish population. That means the ultra-Orthodox, who originally were non-Zionist but have become more and more militant and Zionist, and the national religious people who started in basically are the bedrock of the settlement enterprise, they have 5, 6, 7 children per family, while secular Israelis, liberals, mostly Ashkenazi families have somewhere between 2 and 3 children per family. And if this trend continues, Israel will, the 20% or whatever it is of religious, 25%, 28% of religious families in Israel will become 30% and 40%, moving on to 50%, and secular and liberal Israelis their numbers will diminish. And this will turn Israel even more rightward and less able to compromise, more expansionist. It'll be terrible, but that's the way it's going at the moment demographically.
Is there anything about the state of Israel that gives you hope for optimism?
The only thing which gives me hope is that the whole Zionist enterprise is illogical, made little sense. Nobody believed from the start, or almost nobody believed from the start, that it could actually achieve statehood, or that Israeli statehood could reach, if you like, the heights in terms of the internal creativity, science, prosperity, which it has reached now. So a lot of things have gone against what common sense says. Nonetheless, they've happened. I'm not saying it's miraculous, but it certainly hasn't followed a convenient, logical pattern, the development of the state of Israel. So maybe that's grounds for optimism, that maybe my anticipation or predictions about the bad way things are going are incorrect. Maybe logic will be overcome by something else.
We'll see. Benny Morris, thank you very much for joining me today.
My pleasure.